Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Hammarberg is a Swedish diplomat and a human rights defender. He's held the post of the Council of Europe High Commissioner for Human Rights in Strasbourg. He has been Secretary General of the Stockholm-based Olof Palme International Center, as well as Ambassador of the Swedish government on humanitarian affairs. And I see that a lot of his CV hasn't been included here, but it's for the name of time. One thing I'll just add, of course, he's the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize and has done so much through his work with Amnesty International and beyond. I'm also very honored to be sitting next to you and to have you on our panel. So if we could please give a warm welcome to Mr. Thomas Hammarberg.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I will actually follow through on what Rosa said, because I think we are touching here a very, very important aspect of the continued work for human rights, and the notion that more and more people feel that they are treated as not as individuals with civil rights, but as consumers with the freedom to buy or not buy goods and services, sort of commercial objects rather than individuals with human rights, which is a note that quite a number of people are making nowadays in the discussion. My starting point would be the Agenda 2030, the document that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly some months ago. I think that's a very unique document and is worthwhile analyzing in depth by the human rights community. Of course, it's a follow-up on the Millennium Goals, and when they ended last year, the idea was to build another similar document for the forthcoming 15 years. But the changes are very clear. First of all, it covers a much broader area. It addresses all countries in the world, all member states of the United Nations, and not only the most poor ones, which is an important aspect. If you look at the subject matters dealt with, the sort of substance of the agenda, I think it's fair to say that there are two major concerns which are addressed there, others as well, but the main ones, in my interpretation, would be there is a need of consistent adjustments to the climate change challenge. Climate change is a major aspect of this document. And the other one, not so much discussed actually, is something has to be done to the growing social gaps in societies, the gap that is growing between the poor and the wealthy. The injustices built in there is there in the agenda, and there are recommendations there. And that's what I wanted to talk about here. Another difference from the Millennium Goal document is that this one also addresses not only governments in all countries in the world, but also the business community and the civil societies, the non-governmental organizations. And there is a sort of appeal that they would take part in implementation of the agenda as such. And I think when it comes to how to address the growing gaps, there is quite a lot to take from this document. The problem with the document is that it's fairly weak when it comes to implementation. The monitoring mechanism is still under discussion within the United Nations, and there it's important that there is a human rights input to secure that there will be something that really holds governments and others responsible for implementation of this document. It's clear that the regulatory framework when it comes to big business, as Rosa talked about, is not strong enough. Some of us, when we took the position that we wanted the European Union to develop, we hoped that the European Union would set the framework for economic activities so that it would not be possible for companies, corporations to misuse their position in the sense of what would end up in violations of human rights. And that framework isn't really there. The WTO, IMF, World Bank, etc., does not give the limitations that we need in today's world in order to avoid that big business, the transnational companies, would violate basic rights for people. And this disconnect we have there is, I think, one of the most urgent human rights challenges today. And we see the reports about tax evasion, which has an impact on economic and social rights. We see the reports about corruption. We will hear more about that today. It's also an effect of the lack of regulatory framework when it comes to the flow of capital and the global market economies. So there is something there that I think the Agenda 2030 would be the basis for discussing in more depth. The trade unions in the world, I would say, is in a crisis situation. They are outmaneuvered by big business, but they are also not supported by governments. The ILO, as a consequence of this, is also in a crisis situation. We have reports about the employers' representatives in ILO are really not taking part in the discussions any longer. There have been requests from them that possibilities for strikes, for instance, would be deleted from parts of the rules that have been agreed within ILO. I think that's very serious, and there is a need to protect ILO in this particular situation. The Swedish government has now begun to develop a concept which could form a sort of a framework for further discussion about addressing this problem. The Prime Minister calls it a global deal to protect decent work and inclusive growth. The idea being that the gains from economic development must be fairly distributed among people. And the hope is that that would be a concept that could spur a discussion within the international organizations, but also inside governments, which would secure that the decent work concept within ILO and some other organizations will really be realities in the future. And this in turn requires, of course, a basic recognition of economic and social rights. These are human rights. There have been many discussions and decisions within the United Nations, but also in the regional organizations, to make clear that economic and social rights are part of the human rights package. And in fact, the interrelationship between civil and political rights and economic and social rights are absolutely crucial. And you undermine the whole concept of human rights if you deny economic and social rights to be fully recognized as human rights. And as you know, the problem there is largely the position of Washington, where the position is that still that economic and social rights aren't really human rights. They are ambitions, but they are not really human rights. And it's very important to take the discussion with the Americans that this is not what we mean with human rights. The United States has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They have not ratified the Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. And this is one consequence of their position. And I hope that there will be more emphasis from Europe, Africa, Latin America, and Asia to try to push the Americans to take part in the common work for all human rights, because that is crucial now when it comes to addressing the problems that the Agenda 2030 would like to address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hammarberg, for enlightening us on how we can ensure universal and economic social rights. And I think definitely this issue of the inequalities and the gap is essential. And Agenda 2013 is at least a starting point.